Mother-in-law secretly poisoned my dog, acted like nothing happened. Her reaction shocked everyone. I found my golden retriever Bailey dead on the kitchen floor at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. Just 12 hours earlier, she'd been wagging her tail at my mother-in-law's dinner table, begging for scraps like she always did. The vet's words still echo in my mind. Mrs. Patterson, this wasn't natural. Your dog was poisoned with antifreeze. That's when everything I thought I knew about my husband's family crumbled. Bailey had been my shadow for 3 years. I'd rescued her from a shelter in Portland right after college, and she'd moved with me from my cramped studio apartment to the house Jake and I bought in suburban Minneapolis. She was perfectly healthy, just 2 years old, with the kind of boundless energy that golden retrievers are famous for. The night before, we'd been at Jake's parents' house for their monthly family dinner, a tradition his mother Margaret insisted on maintaining religiously. Margaret had always claimed to be severely allergic to dogs, constantly complaining about Bailey's presence whenever we visited. She'd make a big show of taking her allergy medication, dabbing at her eyes with tissues, and opening windows for fresh air. Jake always defended his mother, suggesting we leave Bailey at home for future visits. But I'd grown suspicious of Margaret's theatrical allergies. They seemed to conveniently appear only when Bailey was around, never when we encountered other dogs during family outings. The night of the dinner, Margaret had been unusually interested in Bailey. She'd actually petted her, something she'd never done before, and even gave her some leftover chicken from her plate. I remembered feeling surprised and hopeful that maybe she was finally warming up to my dog. Jake had smiled at me across the table, whispering that his mom was coming around. Now, staring at the vet's toxicology report, I realized her sudden affection had been calculated and deadly. The antifreeze levels in Bailey's system were astronomical, enough to kill a dog twice her size. Dr. Morrison, our veterinarian, had seen many accidental poisonings over his 20-year career, but this wasn't accidental. Someone had deliberately given Bailey a lethal dose. I drove home from the vet clinic in a daze, my mind racing between grief and a growing, terrible suspicion. Jake was at work, unaware that our beloved dog was gone. I sat in my car outside our house, staring at the empty leash hanging on our front porch, trying to process what had happened. The timeline was too perfect, too convenient. Bailey had been fine until that dinner. Update. I know this sounds unbelievable, but I had to share what happened next. Found security footage that changed everything. Have you ever discovered something about someone close to you that completely shattered your trust? Margaret Patterson had never liked me. From the moment Jake first brought me home 4 years ago, she'd made it clear I wasn't good enough for her precious son. She'd criticize everything from my teaching career to my modest wardrobe, always with a smile that never reached her eyes. Jake would laugh off her comments, calling them just mom being mom, but I felt the venom behind every seemingly innocent observation about my background, my family, or my lifestyle choices. The dog issue had become a particular point of contention. Margaret lived in a pristine McMansion in Edina, where every surface gleamed and every decorative pillow sat perfectly positioned. She treated her home like a museum, and Bailey's presence clearly disturbed her sense of control. She'd follow me around with a lint roller whenever we visited, making pointed comments about animal hair and cleanliness standards. What I'd initially dismissed as typical controlling mother-in-law behavior had escalated over the past year. She'd started making increasingly cruel comments about Bailey, suggesting we rehome her because dogs were too much responsibility for young couples. She'd researched local shelters and even printed out adoption paperwork, presenting it to us during a Christmas dinner with a sweet smile and a suggestion that it's never too late to make better choices. Jake's response had always been frustrating. He'd inherited his father's passive personality, preferring to avoid conflict rather than stand up to his mother. Whenever I complained about Margaret's behavior, he'd suggest I was being too sensitive or reading too much into things. He genuinely seemed to believe his mother's intentions were good, despite the mounting evidence of her manipulative nature. I'd been teaching 3rd grade at Minnetonka Elementary for 2 years, and my students often asked about Bailey during show-and-tell sessions. She was therapy-trained and sometimes visited my classroom, bringing joy to kids who were struggling with reading or dealing with difficult home situations. Bailey wasn't just my pet. She was part of my identity as an educator and a source of comfort for dozens of children. The morning after Bailey's death, I couldn't bring myself to tell my students what had happened. I called in sick and spent the day researching antifreeze poisoning, trying to understand how someone could commit such a calculated act of cruelty. The symptoms were horrific, initially appearing like drunkenness, followed by apparent recovery, then sudden kidney failure and death. Bailey would have suffered for hours before dying alone on our kitchen floor. 3 days after Bailey's death, I made a decision that would change everything. I installed a security camera system in our house, something Jake and I had discussed but never gotten around to doing, but I wasn't trying to prevent future break-ins. I was looking for evidence of what had happened that night. The security company had upgraded our neighbor's system the previous month, and their cameras had a clear view of our backyard and the area around our kitchen window. When I explained the situation to Mrs. Chen next door, she immediately offered to check her footage from the night Bailey died. What we found was worse than I'd imagined. At 9:47 p.m., roughly 30 minutes after we'd returned from dinner at Margaret's house, figure could be seen moving around our backyard. The timestamp showed this was long after Jake and I had gone to bed. The motion-activated lights revealed Margaret's silver Honda Accord parked on the street, and the footage clearly showed her letting herself into our yard through the side gate, using a key I didn't know she had. The camera captured her kneeling beside Bailey's outdoor water bowl, pouring something from a small container into the water. She'd spent approximately 15 minutes in our yard, presumably waiting to ensure Bailey drank the poisoned water. The footage showed Bailey approaching the bowl and drinking, tail wagging, while Margaret watched from behind our garden shed. Sat in Mrs. Chen's living room, watching this evidence of premeditated murder, feeling physically sick. Margaret hadn't just impulsively poisoned my dog during dinner. She'd planned this carefully, obtaining a key to our property, bringing poison with her, and returning hours later to complete her crime. The level of calculation and cruelty was staggering. Jake's reaction when I showed him the footage was initially disbelief, then desperate attempts to find alternative explanations. He suggested maybe his mother had been trying to help by bringing Bailey special treats. Maybe she'd accidentally used a contaminated container. Maybe the security footage was somehow misleading. His refusal to accept the obvious truth infuriated me more than Margaret's crime itself. I made copies of the footage and drove to the police station the next morning. Detective Rodriguez took my statement and assured me that animal cruelty charges would be filed, but he warned that prosecution would be challenging without Margaret's confession. The evidence was circumstantial, and expensive defense attorneys often succeeded in creating reasonable doubt in cases like this. That's when I decided to confront Margaret directly, in front of the entire family. I planned the confrontation for the following Sunday's family dinner, a gathering I knew Margaret wouldn't miss. I arrived early and helped set the table, acting as normally as possible while my heart raced with anticipation. Jake's sister Linda and her husband Tom were there, along with Jake's father Robert, who'd always been kind to me despite his wife's hostility. As we sat down to eat Margaret's famous roast beef, I waited for the right moment. The conversation had turned to weekend plans when I quietly placed a printed screenshot from the security footage next to Margaret's plate. The image clearly showed her kneeling beside Bailey's water bowl, the timestamp visible in the corner. The transformation in Margaret's face was immediate and terrifying. The mask of polite superiority she'd worn for years dissolved, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. Her eyes darted around the table, taking in everyone's shocked expressions, before settling on me with undisguised hatred. Instead of denial or explanation, Margaret's response revealed the depth of her psychopathy. She laughed, a sound I'll never forget, and asked if I seriously thought that stupid mutt was worth destroying family relationships. When Jake tried to intervene, asking her to explain what she'd been doing in our yard, Margaret's composure cracked completely. The words that poured out of her mouth shocked everyone at the table. She ranted about how Bailey had been ruining family gatherings, how dogs were disgusting creatures that didn't belong in civilized homes, and how she'd done us all a favor by solving the problem. But the most chilling revelation came when she mentioned this wasn't her first time dealing with problematic pets. Linda gasped when Margaret casually mentioned the neighbor's cat that had died the previous year and old Mr. Henderson's beagle that had been found dead in his backyard 6 months ago. The pattern was becoming clear. Margaret had been systematically poisoning neighborhood pets for years, and none of us had connected the dots. Robert, Jake's father, sat in stunned silence as his wife of 35 years revealed herself to be a calculating killer. The man who'd always defended Margaret's strong personality was seeing her true nature for the first time, and the shock was written across his face. Update. The family dinner turned into chaos after Margaret's confession. Police are now investigating other suspicious pet deaths in the neighborhood. Would you have confronted someone like this publicly or handled it differently? The aftermath of that dinner was swift and devastating for the Patterson family. Robert called the police himself, unable to reconcile the woman he'd married with the person who'd been systematically murdering innocent animals for years. Margaret was arrested 2 days later and charged with multiple counts of animal cruelty, trespassing, and possession of poison with intent to harm. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of Margaret's crimes. Police found detailed journals in her bedroom, documenting her hatred for various neighborhood pets and her methods for eliminating them. She'd been using social media and neighborhood apps to track pet owners' schedules, learning when animals would be alone and vulnerable. The journals contained photos of animals she'd targeted, along with sick trophies, collars, and toys she'd collected from her victims. Jake's reaction throughout the legal proceedings was perhaps the most painful part of the entire experience. Initially, he tried to support both his mother and me, suggesting we could work through this as a family. When I explained that I could never forgive someone who deliberately murdered Bailey, he accused me of being vindictive and unwilling to show Christian forgiveness. His inability to understand the severity of his mother's actions or the depth of my grief created an unbridgeable gap between us. The neighborhood's response was immediate and intense. Mrs. Henderson, whose beagle had been one of Margaret's earlier victims, organized a support group for affected families. The local news picked up the story, and Margaret's face appeared on evening broadcasts as the suburban serial pet killer. The coverage brought forward more victims, families who'd lost pets over the past 5 years and had never suspected foul play. Dr. Morrison, Bailey's veterinarian, testified as an expert witness during Margaret's trial. He explained how anti-freeze poisoning works, describing the prolonged suffering animals endure before death. His testimony was crucial in establishing the cruelty charges, as Margaret's defense team tried to portray her actions as impulsive rather than premeditated torture. Thorough psychological evaluation ordered by the court revealed Margaret's long history of antisocial behavior. She'd been fired from several jobs for conflicts with coworkers, had no close friendships, and demonstrated classic signs of narcissistic personality disorder with psychopathic tendencies. The evaluator testified that Margaret showed no genuine remorse for her actions, viewing the pets she'd killed as obstacles to her preferred lifestyle rather than living beings worthy of protection. Jake and I separated 3 months after his mother's arrest. He moved back into his childhood home to support his father, while I remained in our house, now equipped with professional security cameras and a new rescue dog named Sadie, whom I adopted from the same shelter where I'd found Bailey. The marriage counselor we briefly tried suggested our fundamental values were incompatible, and I realized she was right. Margaret was sentenced to 18 months in county jail and 5 years of probation, along with mandatory psychological counseling and a permanent ban on owning pets. The sentence felt inadequate considering the scope of her crimes, but the prosecutor explained that animal cruelty charges rarely result in significant jail time, even for repeat offenders. 2 years later, I'm teaching at a different school district and living in a new house with Sadie, who's become as beloved by my students as Bailey once was. I've started volunteering with animal rescue organizations, helping to educate families about pet safety and the warning signs of animal abuse. My experience with Margaret taught me that cruelty often hides behind respectable facades, and that speaking up for vulnerable creatures is worth the personal cost. Jake and I finalized our divorce last year. He eventually acknowledged that his mother's actions were unforgivable, but by then, too much damage had been done to our relationship. He's in therapy now, working through years of normalized manipulation and emotional abuse. We exchange Christmas cards, and he's dating someone his mother will never meet, since she's moved to a care facility in another state. The most satisfying outcome has been the changes in our old neighborhood. Mrs. Chen started a pet safety network, and several families installed security cameras after hearing about Margaret's crimes. The local police department created an animal welfare task force, and Detective Rodriguez still checks in occasionally to see how I'm doing. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I hadn't found that security footage, if I'd just accepted Bailey's death as a tragic accident. Margaret would still be living freely, probably planning her next victim. The thought keeps me awake some nights, but it also reinforces my belief that fighting for justice, even when it's difficult and painful, is always the right choice. Update. Margaret violated her probation last month and is back in jail. Her ex-husband Robert has become an advocate for stronger animal cruelty laws. Sometimes justice takes time, but it does come. Do you think I was right to destroy my marriage to expose the truth?